first meetings here, I think it was April 2017, April or May 2017. And from then, we have moved through several stages of the study and ended up with the report that you have a copy of, as well as a little bit of what we're talking about today. A couple of things I want to emphasize here, certainly at the on the bottom left, we have three of us who are co-PIs who work very closely together. You already heard about me and Dr. Pasala, Dr. Duarte Morai. He will be presenting a little bit of this in a minute, and I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about his work because he is doing additional and complementary work in this region as well, which I think fits with all of this. We began with a couple of things. One is the principles we operated from. You heard our community psychology, and any kind of work that I do is focused on that. So what you see up on the top left, engaging community was our primary focus, and broadly engaging community, prioritizing the assets, and of course equine being the assets, researching the possibilities, and there's a lot of them in this area, in addition to equine, but I think also are complementary, and we try to integrate that into our design. Designing a model that would be equitable, inclusive, and sustainable, contribute to community and economic development, and where community members, private industries, local and regional academic institutions can partner on enhancing a regional equine-based economy. President Dalton mentioned that we have always looked at this as not replacing anything, but complementing what is here. And we believe that the design that we have come up with, it will evolve. It is not final, but it is in that, in a sense, to complement as opposed to really do anything more than that. So we're excited about that. The last thing I'll mention for this particular slide is that I've been working with our University Office for Outreach and Engagement. And so we are a research one, extensive university, a land-grant university that has a very robust extension service, right? However, from our perspectives, we are faculty members, we are researchers, we are scholars, and so everything we do has to fit within that scholarship frame. However, we view that scholarship frame as an engagement scholarship. And essentially what that means is that a lot of researchers come into communities with ideas and theories and concepts in their head and do their research on that. We approach it differently. We gather the information from what communities want and try to use our expertise to help move those desires, those ideas, and those realities, or those things into becoming reality. So it is an engagement process that we operate from and we find most important, and something we are trying to push more and more researchers and scholars to do at NC State University. Many of you have seen previous presentations we've done. What's up on the top left, and again, it's in the report, just real briefly to walk you through how we got to where we are. We did a regional community analysis, a long-term engagement, as I mentioned, with people across sectors in the community. We did our own literature review and research of models that are already out there, and tried to pull that together through analytical tools, content analytical tools in particular, and came up with a master plan that you'll see in a second. And then from that, the spatial programming and design that is possible based upon those things we thought were most viable and most possible in this community. So that was the approach, and we recognized that moving forward, the successful implementation of what we're now calling a kind of Equine Research and Education Center is going to require a continuation of that partnership. And as I mentioned earlier, I came into the room, the energy and the kinds of things people might talk about before we get out of here. I know what Tim has been working on with ICC. I heard some other things that's going over on Tryon International going going on and trying international in terms of, I believe it's the para-equestrian. I think all of those are also complementary and coming together to, I think, continue to grow the equine industry in the region. So now I will turn it over to my colleague and partner in this endeavor, Dr. Moore.
Good afternoon. So my role today is to give you a little information about the business model of running this center. We were asked an interesting role of thinking of something really that the region could be excited about, that could in a way be self-funded through its own revenues, and then at the same time they would not, as President Dalton mentioned, kind of cannibalize other initiatives, other businesses that are going on in the area. And one of the first things we did was to look at other centers, university centers, community partnership university centers with focus on equine, but also other ones that are not equine related, and talk to the administrators or the faculty there, or communities, and even cyber stalk them a little bit in the media to see the bad news, the bad headlines, and the positive headlines. Try to not walk the same path as other initiatives that haven't been as thoughtful. And we also did one detail on our research, included an online survey to the business community in the Rutherford County and Polk area. Some of you might have filled it out. You had a pretty good response rate. And so those quantitative data, we then contrasted them with the time we spent here in the community to interpret what the business community was telling us as the things that the economy in this region needed, how it could leverage the growing equine-based economy. Okay, and so then because we are this interdisciplinary team, we kind of exchanged notes and integrated those ideas, those business ideas, with design, spatial design thinking. And as you can see in that image over there, we thought of a spatial distribution of this center that includes a research component in dark blue, and I'll talk to you about each of the research labs that we envisioned having there. And then in green is a kind of a livable space for athletes and faculty and teams, and perhaps also some visitors that come to events. And then in orange is a clear statement that there will be a space to make sure this center energizes the local business networks and local business development. Okay? So let me talk to you a little bit about each of these. The report actually has something that's called a business model canvas for each of these units listed. And that's kind of, in business development, there's a business plan. It's kind of the holy grail of business planning and starting a new business. But in this age of like startups and fast pace of change in society, there's kind of a gravity towards adopting this simpler canvas that has how the revenue will be acquired, where the money will be spent, who the customers are. So that's called a business model canvas. And we made one for each of these. It's kind of like the brush strokes on how to run each of these units in this center. And we also thought of these complex network of units in the center as that perhaps some of them would have to be developed at the same time, but in your own minds, and your committee might think about which units could be replaced or used temporarily, initially at least, with some existing infrastructure and partnerships with institutions in the region, and then perhaps at some point they would actually be built the way we propose in this plan. So they are all separate. We thought of them separately, but they are interdependent with each other. Okay, so let's start at the right, at the local business hive. A bit of a looming danger is to create a center that becomes an enclave, that pursues high-level equine research and there's some multi-million-dollar grants happening there, and they might even benefit some of the equestrian teams and owners and industry, but all of that energy, all of those dollars are operating and circulating independent of you, of your community. And that could be a tragedy. That's actually the typical situation in these kinds of centers. So that's why we like to start with this. We want to make sure that what we propose to you energizes your community instead of leveraging the landscape and the equine heritage that you already had for its own benefit in isolation. Okay? So one of the things to start with is the visitor and community concierge. So if you think about the visitor center, this is not a visitor center. This is a place that engages also with the community. We were inspired, for example, by TAIEC, how they have free events and invite schools and local community to come to events to engage the community with the equine culture and sport. All right? So we thought of this, that it would need to be, we explained a little bit how that can be accomplished, but that's one of the things that we would like to see, we would encourage seeing in this area. So there's knowledge about places to go, things to see, events. FENS, for example, also has a long tradition of engaging local community, people from the community, and that's that real connection of your community and all levels with equine gives you integrity as a destination, right? Any place in the world with decent weather could have a big equine center, but they cannot buy your real equine DNA, essentially, as a community. So that's kind of part of that, of what we want to reflect with that first unit. The other one is that we see more and more and more that visitors to a place, they want to eat local food. And so instead of having just a visitor center, etc., when people come, we notice also that a lot of lodging in your region is in individual units spread around the countryside. So where do people go grocery shopping? They have grocery stores in their home, and they may not be ready to shop on Saturdays at the farmer's market, I think in Forest City and a couple other places. So could there be, during the high season for events, for example, could there be a demand for people come to the area, they arrive to the visitor center, they can buy some supplies. The notion of the business incubators, actually I know that Isothermo is already involved in this process in other initiatives, so this would be symbiotic with that. But to mention briefly, one of the points that the committee is going to mention on is the cluster-based economic development. What we see here is that this center will be energizing research and innovation in all levels of the equine cluster, and then that will give birth to new small companies. And so if you imagine isothermal, developing technical skills for young people, and then new innovations coming up, new companies are spun off from that new technology, and that all is kind of starting, the first steps are happening in this center. Okay? And then the Equine History Science Museum was something we created kind of as demand, as request from the community. You wanted a place where your central place, kind of like a terra neutra, a neutral place where the history of the community, from fans to TAIEC and farms and other connections to equine culture could be featured. I think at NC State for sure, and perhaps at other universities, there's research on the interpretation. You go to a national park and they have those displays explaining to you how the water cycle and the salamander, the role of the salamander on a swamp, etc. There's science behind that, right? So imagine a place that's like a teaching lab for interpretation sciences, where professors like us in that field would experiment with telling the story of equine sciences and equine culture. Okay? So on to the village. One thing that was obvious actually in the field, we talked to with a few team coaches from colleges in this area that come for competitions. At FENS, for example, we had some good hangout time with some teams that were there doing competitions. They talked about, they stay at hotels sometime, but it can be weird to have all these young athletes, and there's a lot of anonymous kind of space. They would like to be in a place where they could be close to horses. So they talked to us about you know, the kinds of units. And then I have the privilege of collaborating with Don Kaysen quite a bit, and he knows a lot about the hospitality industry. So him and other people that know about running a hospitality business gave us advice on the shape of the units, how many, how big, etc., so that they could make revenue and be self-sustaining. Initially, the need for a place to stay was because of the research labs. If you imagine having research labs here, a certain distance from campuses of NC State, Clemson, University of Knoxville, researchers like us will have to stay somewhere like tonight and last night we stayed here, right, in a hotel. But if there is a place that's kind of a researcher home, we can bring students, we can stay lodged there, and so that will create kind of a pretty good level of revenue for, you know, to have life, to have movement in these labs. Skipping to the food services marketplace, institutions are really afraid of food services, and now, you know, there's many interesting models. We propose some models on having availability of food services when there's a conference, when there's a workshop from Extension, and also when there's teams staying there, but in a way that would create demand for local food companies, like the wonderful barbecue we had today at lunch that has catered some of our meetings here. You know, so how could that, we thought of ways in which this center could draw upon these local businesses instead of having a boring, you know, chicken breast kind of lunch, dinner, breakfast type of experience. In addition to that, we expected that these would be a learning lab for isothermal, for their hospitality programs, where students would be there in internships and have team meals, etc. And lastly, then, the holy grail of the center, the big center draw, the anchor of why we propose developing this. It's kind of a state-of-the-art research hub. And the way we feel that these works is that you have these different thematic units. They have different requirements for the facilities and for the costs and the infrastructure, and they will draw a lot of their revenue from grants. So that's kind of how it will have to run. Essentially, researchers from these universities around you, you have something special to offer. If they studied marine ecology, then, you know, they will be running grants, $1 million, and part of that money is for renting a big ship, a lab ship that goes into the ocean, perhaps. So if they're doing research about issues that you are really have a really interesting stuff happening here, then they will pay money to do those studies here. One of the topics is equine health and equine sciences related to nutrition, and we even dug in a little bit into what are the issues that are really interesting in your area. And we learned, for example, that breeding is probably not one because of the policies in terms of insemination or equine insemination in North Carolina. They're not very conducive to that kind of research, and that kind of topic is more hot, it's hotter and more pressing in kind of horse racing, gambling kind of stuff in other areas. But equine health, longevity, asthma, obesity, topics like that, so things with nutrition, those things, this is a really good place to study those topics, okay? So our colleagues at NC State and from Clemson and Knoxville, a couple other universities, gave us advice on kind of what kinds of issues they would really like to have the chance to study here. And one of the things to point out here is that you need to have a research herd. But many of these places already have a research herd close to campus. What they do not have is a network of horse owners that are all kind of friends of the lab and that can be enlisted for, you know, weight loss programs, for example. So imagine you have 30 farms with 2 or 3 horses, and they are members of this consortium that can be tapped into certain studies that have a special dietary supplement or something like that, and then they are monitored a little while. They can be remunerated from the money on those grants. And that way the researcher doesn't have to rely on a herd that they have to feed and lodge all the time in between studies. Right? So this is just an example of the special kind of research that could be really interesting here. The second one is to kind of poke the bee's nest that is the notion of smart cities. You may have heard about that. It's a really big buzzword. Raleigh is just going crazy with it. We have lots of internal grants and federal grants to try to make Raleigh a smart city. And essentially, it's cities that have real-time collection of data, and then those data are crunched and visualized in meaningful ways so that the city managers can make decisions in parking, traffic, policing, etc. So what nobody has proposed until now is smart rural areas, right? So imagine you just had a big storm here, and we've had big storms I heard since February of 2018, it's been one big storm after another. And we heard from doing work with you that runoff from equine waste was an issue, and it needs to be monitored. So imagine if you have a large network of landowners that allow these labs to have a sensor measuring the level of waste in their streams. And then that is telemetrically sent to an information system, and is stored and monitored, and we have kind of like a weather map kind of thing, but related to pollutants in streams. And the scientists can see how that's all happening, and then the county can know what the water quality is in all of these places. So that's just an example of what you could do like nobody else in the world. This center and your region could fuel and be the host of this kind of science. And then the third one is particularly coming with energy from Rutherford County, because Rutherford County has a strong heritage in manufacturing. There's already businesses there doing things with footing and fences and other manufacturing of products. We heard, for example, we'd like a horse trailer factory here, right? And so imagine aligning that industrial spirit and DNA, potentially investment and capital, with NC State's strong engineering and innovation pedigree. And then you have innovations in equine safety and footing and all of these other technologies that stem from these industry-university partnerships that come up with new patents, and they are then built here in your region. Okay? The last one I want to mention, I'll skip over the equine-assisted therapy lab because Craig is going to elaborate on it. But the last one is also something that stems really, we haven't heard about it anywhere else, but here it seems like it's crucial to this center. And it's the notion that if you have these strong equine-based demand side, right, demanding feed and demanding footing and demanding wood chips, where are those things coming from? There's, for example, a pretty strong feed program and expertise in extension here. And there is the notion that there's a demand for certain kind of hay among the horse owners. But it's difficult to get landowners, farmers, to produce these other kind of hay that fetches a premium value. And instead, the horse owners are bringing hay from far away. So how do you integrate this crop, soil science and agriculture science and production and business of pricing that hay and understanding the market to see how can we make the market understand that maybe they can buy that kind of hay here, because then you have a much healthier agricultural sector in the county producing locally, so you save on transportation, you save on crowding of roads, and the horse owners benefit as well. So it's a win-win-win-win-win. So what we propose here is a truly transdisciplinary lab that looks at the production of that supply the needs of the horse owners locally to the extent that's possible. All right? And we explain how that can be accomplished. And I'll pass it on to Craig.
Okay, real quick, because I want to leave plenty of time, because there's some other presentations here, just to kind of scale out a little bit more of one of the areas that seemed to keep popping up, and that was equine and human health. And we had assistance primarily from Dr. Elizabeth Craig, Department of Communications, and a graduate student who did some deeper dig on this. And the last time we were here, they did a presentation. And again, there was a lot of energy from people in the area about, yeah, that seems to be a niche that does not exist and that could be exploited, frankly, in this area. And so those of you who may be familiar, there's a lot of different areas relative to equines and human health, equine-assisted, we're calling it research and therapy. So we would propose that both research as well as therapeutic practices and other opportunities the possibility of that taking place at this particular center. The research points to a lot of benefits across a lot of different areas and populations: at-risk youth, PTSD, neglect and abuse, quality of life among elderly, and even leadership training has been shown to be beneficial using horses, using the kind of equine models, and in a variety of ways in which it is positively effective for human health overall. So we think there's a lot of opportunity there. Locally, when we looked at the context, right, across the different populations, the different groups, there is a lot to pull from, both in terms of research, in terms of the kinds of therapeutic practices, as well as what already exists with some of the existing programs in the area, in particular over at Fence. And so what you will find in the report, in the appendix of the report, is a kind of beginning proposal for how this could play itself out. In this case, over a 3-year period, right? So the goal would be to generate the kind of research and energy around equine-assisted activities locally, right? Using, working with, partnering with the existing organizations statewide. There's a lot of these organizations statewide and a lot of places that get questions and research ideas, research questions about this, about equine assisted activities, as well as nationally, and the degree to which this could become perhaps a national center for these kinds of activities. And as you see there, funding is relative to all of those things, and would be both externally and internally. And as we think about it as related to NC State, we think there's going to be a need for interinstitutional partnerships, primarily with perhaps UNC, giving the medical school, as well as the vet school at NC State, as well as some of our other disciplinary areas, because no one institution at this point in time has all the expertise to pull this together. So it's going to require some interinstitutional cooperation. And so now I'll turn it over to Chalene, who will introduce you to all the beautiful physical representation of this plan that we have in the law.
Thanks, Greg. So thank you everyone for being here, and we are very excited actually to reveal our work to you. Actually, most of my presentation, I would say, it will be outside, because we prepared those display boards for your review, and rather than actually flipping through the slides very quickly here, we want you to spend time out there, review the information, and we will be there too to answer questions as well as engage in conversations with you. Dr. Morai and Dr. Brookins have already talked about the idea behind this proposed center and the life and the experiences that we could expect actually in this proposed center. While you review the information outside, I also want you to pay attention to we as design team actually how we utilize all this information and reflect it in the creation of the physical environment. We are not saying that what you see outside, that's how exactly what the center will look like, but it is more about really what are those key principles that we should make sure that actually the proposed center should accommodate as you move forward shaping this idea for this future center. So as a design team, we took all that information and tried to reflect it in support of the proposed vision that will enable multidisciplinary research and educational activities to happen on this site. and in support of the community's needs. So, and there were some guiding objectives and principles that we kept in mind while we were shaping these ideas. We wanted to make sure that we create an environment that it reflects this center's goals. We wanted to make sure that this center and its design will provide and maintain healthy environments for both people as well as the animals. That we will also create a site that it is sustainable, minimizing the energy use, and it will also support sustainable land management for research, teaching, farming, preservation of natural areas, as well as other uses on the site. We wanted to make sure that this site actually becomes a highly functioning site that is an asset and destination for the community, rather than creating a siloed campus or a complex. We wanted to make sure that it's a place for researchers, but as well as for the community members to enjoy. And also, we try to think into the future that doesn't exist yet. We wanted to make sure that we design and build the research facilities in particular by anticipating the changes actually in the ways that, for example, researchers actually operate these days. The way that how we work, it's really changing. We are becoming more multidisciplinary. It's not about just siloed lab environments anymore, but it's variation of different spaces that comes together, that brings different researchers together, where they are able to interact with each other in a continuing basis. So we try to envision those research wings. So rather than just individual spaces, really we try to create those facilities that incorporates these functions and facilities in support of these collaborative as well as multidisciplinary efforts that also brings the community members into the equation. So that being said, I know we have other presentations that were going on in this room, but after the presentations, we will invite you outside, and all of our project team members actually will be there. And I also would like to recognize Panti, who is at the back and has been taking photos, but she is one of our graduate students from Let's Give Architecture, and she was really very instrumental and key to the creation of a lot of and production of the design ideas. So we will all be outside there to answer your questions. So thank you so much, and I will turn it back to Craig.
Okay, just want to finish with acknowledgments and thank everybody in this room, certainly first and foremost people, organizations, businesses in this region. I think 2015, I kind of knew Triumph existed. I couldn't, if I'm honest, I couldn't tell you I knew how to get here. I also knew that it was birthplace of Nina Simone, but beyond that, it has been truly a pleasure to not just learn about the region, but to learn more about horses than I ever thought I would know. I'm so glad that we got involved in this, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues as well. I want to thank our research team, and of course, I can talk about the college in particular, the funding provided by both Appalachian Regional Commission as well as the Isothermal Community College. So with that, I think we're going to close out our part of the section. We'll meet you out there. However, the next part of the program, I guess Walter's going to introduce.
Thank you, Phil. Marta and Craig, I think you can see why they get excited about it and share all of their work. And I hope you'll look at the quotes that have been made about the project. I think they're impressive. People get excited. I would say you've talked to Jack Cecil. He's all over this, and he loves the research center. He loves that idea in Western North Carolina, in this part of Western North Carolina. But as excited as you get, when the committee looked at it, there were two things. One, Mr. Benfield from Rutherford County is here too. Thank you, Mike, for being here. When we looked at the report, we thought it was great, but we were a little concerned that somebody in that audience was going to say, wait a minute, that's what I do. and they would feel that it was competing. And the key to this too is that we do not want to compete, but we want to evolve, and we want to work together. This thing is to be built out in phases. We feel isothermal is already into the first phase, and you'll hear just a little bit later. But we also thought we had some, maybe we had some second thoughts. Maybe we need to be looking at a few other things now that we're getting toward the end. So the committee brainstormed. We asked Libby Johnson to prepare a report with the committee's thoughts on that, and it's a short report, but we think kind of that's right where we need it for this particular time. So Libby, if you'll come up. Libby's been great. She knows the equestrian industry. She understands economic development, and we